Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hope you're having an amazing day. There has been a question that has resurfaced on the internet over the past couple of days, and that is, why is the PS5 routinely outperforming or on par with the Series X when the Xbox Series X, in theory, should be so much more powerful than the PS5? If you were just comparing the T-flop number, for example, you have 12 T-flops for the Series X versus just over 10 for the PS5. Well, there's a lot to say about this, and unfortunately this video is going to get a little bit into the weeds. It's going to get a little complicated, so do sit with me, because I'm not only going to speak about the original sources of this, which was a Eurogamer article courtesy of Digital Foundry, but I'm also going to speak about my own sources, plus some other bits and pieces as well. I'm going to do my best to keep the technical stuff as simplified as possible so everyone can follow along. Unfortunately, we are going to somewhat dive into the weeds, and this is going to be a slightly longer video, but well, sit down, get some popcorn, and well, we'll get right into it after this quick message from the sponsor of the video.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they've an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also, of course, sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
So again, if you feel like you've suddenly been kidnapped, put into a DeLorean and taken back about 3 or 4 years, I don't blame you. But since we are entering the mid-generation point at this stage for the PS5 and the Series X, the PS5 Pro is on the horizon, at least according to all of the leaks, it's not too surprising that this is resurfacing. And again, Eurogamer, or should I say Digital Foundry, who have been writing on Eurogamer, have basically been speaking to various developers, and those developers have started to really weigh in and provide a lot of insight. Now, I will say that if you were following quite closely the consoles, a lot of this stuff may not be too surprising. I would also highly encourage you guys to re-watch the Road to PS5 event, which is hosted by Mark Cerny. He really does delve into a lot of the subtle details regarding the PS5's architecture. Unfortunately, there are still some questions he didn't officially answer back then, but it is still extremely interesting to rewatch, and there are a lot of things that perhaps you may have missed the first time around. With that said, Eurogamer cites a couple of major reasons that the PS5 is performing so well. The first is that, well, basically, you have a situation where the GPU compiler on the PS5 is simply more efficient. Secondly, the API of the PS5 is lower level than what this Series X is. Now, the compiler basically, and this is an extremely simplified explanation, takes the code, the game, and then essentially converts it into something that is meaningful for the GPU to run. Now, that is not 100% accurate, and if you are a programmer, you can feel free to write a more detailed explanation in the comments below, or I would recommend you guys check out, perhaps some in-depth explanations on, the internet if you so desire. But again, I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible so everyone can follow along. Now, how effective that is, how efficient that is really important, because basically speaking, imagine if someone was, and this is a kind of a crappy analogy, but I'm making this up on the fly, damn it. Imagine if someone was to tell you, okay, well, you need to kind of like go and meet me at this specific, restaurant in like an hour. And you're like, okay, cool. And you leave the house because you're looking at the directions, and then you leave the house and you're like, you barely make it on time. And you say, oh, thank goodness, I just made it. And the person's like, why the hell did it take you an hour? Well, you could have just taken this shortcut and you're like, well, why didn't you tell me about that previously? In other words, the more clear, the more concise an instruction is, the better, the easier it is to make use of. Now, as for the GPU low-level API, the Xbox Series X certainly does have low-level access. This is a really big thing that Microsoft have done, of course, with DirectX 12, and there's a lot to say about DX12, and Microsoft, to its credit, are doing a lot of very cool stuff with DX12. I recently covered, especially for PC gamers, things like work groups, and there's just a lot of very interesting stuff that they are doing. However, some of this is not so applicable for the Series consoles, for A, and for B, another issue with the Xbox is that, well, a lot of the development environments, first of all, they also have to worry about the Xbox Series S, which is perhaps something that you may also find fault with the PS5 Pro eventually. We'll get to that in a moment. But also it's for PC as well, and that just obviously adds a little bit of extra complexity to the equation. Now, this is particularly true for things like ray tracing. It seems that the PS5's API is just very efficient with ray tracing stuff. But moving on to the hardware, again, if you were to look at things purely from a T-flop perspective, you've got around 12 T-flops for the Xbox Series X, but on the PS5, you've got just over 10. And the question is then, well, how does that work? Well, unfortunately, and this is something that myself, as well as NXG or Michael, was talking about a lot on his YouTube channel, as I think he's also for IGN as well. This is around 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, before the consoles launched even, we were talking about this. You can't just take T-flops, because basically speaking, the GPU on the PS5 runs at just over 2.2 gigahertz. I'm going to round up the figures for everyone's sanity here, as, you know, it's going to be on screen anyway. Meanwhile, the Series X is just over 1800 megahertz, but the major difference between them, aside from the clock frequency, is the number of compute units. You've got 36 for the PS5 and 52 for the Series X. So basically speaking, if you were to look at it from a T-flop perspective, yes, the Series X does win. However, there is also the factor that you need to actually utilize the resources on a GPU. Therefore, a narrower architecture, you simply can get more out of it. It's, again, this is kind of a crappy analogy, but have you ever been to a supermarket and it's like Christmas or some other holiday and they just opened more tills, but because no one knows what the hell to do, there is like no, it's just a free-for-all, guys. It's just like, yeah, I'm sure you'll be fine. No one knows what the hell they're doing. Everyone's trying to cram themselves down this aisle, and it just sucks ass. So we're just going to throw more people at the problem at the end. But because no one really knows what they're doing, sometimes some tills are just not being used. Other times, some people just don't want to walk all the way to the end of the supermarket to go to those tills. So they're just doing absolute crap all anyway. And basically, this is kind of like an analogy of like a GPU and a scheduler. So basically, the whole purpose of having all of those compute units is that they need things to do. So that's the job of things like the scheduler on the GPU. It, well, schedules work to go to specific elements of the GPU. Now, there is a lot more to this as well, because when you have higher clock frequencies, you increase the speed of the caches on the GPU, and that's not a small detail. When the caches run faster, it basically means that data can move in and out of the system. And the whole thing of the PS5, and Cerny mentioned this several times during, you know, the Road to PS5 event, plus interviews. I believe it was with Wired. But it could have been Gamma Sutra. Anyway, he mentioned several times that the whole thing of the whole PS5, you know, design philosophy is get data from the SSD, move it to main system memory, have that data do things, and then flush the caches as required, which is another thing that they have. They've got whole GPU scrubber technology, which kind of the, you know, Series X consoles, they do have some very interesting storage stuff. They have direct storage, which is really nice, and all of this other bits and pieces. But ultimately, this was the whole design philosophy behind the PS5. Now, multiple people, multiple developers, have essentially told me that all of this stuff is true. The the PS5 basically was designed essentially around the purpose of getting data, moving it as fast as possible, and being pretty performant. However, the major philosophy for the PS5 was also to make it as easy as possible for developers, within reason. Obviously, if you've never programmed anything before, you're not going to maximize the potential of the system. Things like the geometry engine on the PS5 is also kind of something to be aware of. Like, the PS5 basically uses primitive shaders. Now, there's an interview, I think the website is 4gamer.net, and there was an interview with David Wang, who is one of the head guys over at Radeon Technologies Group, and he was talking about primitive shaders versus mesh shading. Now, it is worth noting that there are some additional things that Sony did do for the prim shaders for the PS5, additional functionality, not least of which for PSVR stuff, for culling and other bits and bobs for the geometry. But basically, there is some differences between mesh shading and prim shaders. Interestingly, it seems like the PlayStation 5 Pro does actually have mesh shading as well as prim shader support, which is going to be quite interesting to see how that turns out. But ultimately, a lot of this stuff ends up kind of coming out on the wash anyway. And from what I understand, basically the PS5 is just very efficient at what it does. That isn't to say the PS5 doesn't have some drawbacks. There are a couple. The fact it doesn't have hardware variable rate shading can be somewhat of an issue at some points. However, VRS hasn't really taken off that much, even on PC. Whether you can argue that's because consoles are somewhat holding it back, while the Series X does have it. But also, other technologies kind of render VRS somewhat limited, especially a lot of the upscaling stuff. Second point, you've got software VRS on the PS5, which isn't as efficient for obvious reasons. So it's going to be very interesting, to be honest with you. Like, this generation, and I really want to stress, guys, it's not that the Series X console is a bad console. It is very well engineered. And in terms of form factor, this is my personal opinion. I prefer the Series console. I think it just looks more compact. I don't think the PS5 Pro, the PS5 is ugly. Like, initially I didn't really like aesthetics of either console, but the PS5 has somewhat grown on me, honestly, and I think it's fine. Like, it kind of does the trick. I've not had any issues with either console. Both have been pretty rock solid for me, although I don't really play either super amounts. Like, I'm primarily a PC gamer. With that said, yeah, I think that the mid-generation refresh is going to be really interesting. So what about the PS5 Pro? Because it's a much wider GPU architecture, right? You have 52 for the Series X consoles, but the PS5 Pro is even wider, it's 60. Well, the answer is, it kind of seems that, yes, you won't fully maximize the console anyway, for a lot of reasons. Like, the PS5 Pro is kind of a mid-generation console. It's like the PS4 Pro didn't get fully used by most developers. There are a lot of easy knobs and like dials that developers can turn. And a very easy example of this would be, for example, they could just increase the resolution and the frame rate targets of games. There is the upscaling stuff, PSSR, which is basically DLSS, but Sony version. But I think that it's going to be a little bit easier, perhaps. You also can't directly compare them anyway, because the PS5 Pro is an entirely different architecture. Now, details are not official at the moment. When I was first leaking the specifications of the PS5 Pro, and also the fact that the machine existed, I was hearing it was like RDNA 3, but it seems like it's kind of an RDNA 3/4 hybrid, as you know, I've also covered. And basically speaking, the machine is going to be a lot more performant, especially in things like ray tracing. I think from what I've heard from developers who have access to the machine, it seems that the PS5 Pro is pretty easy to use. They probably just won't fully maximize the system in a lot of instances. Like, you're going to be able to, however, have really nice ray tracing and all these other bits and pieces. That isn't to say that you can't fully maximize it. It just means that most developers who are like creating games for the Xbox Series X, the PlayStation 5, the PS5 Pro, the Series S, the PC, and so on. In other words, they're developing on a wide number of different platforms. they may not fully use it because, well, they can't really maximize any port because they just don't physically have enough time. So I think that there is going to be that. However, studios like, for example, Sucker Punch and Naughty Dog, those are definitely going to just absolutely kill it. Now, there are a couple of other things as well that I want to mention, and these are like kind of bonus things. The first is that, yes, the stuff that Eurogamer does speak about, like the low-level GPU access, or sorry, API access, is very true. However, it's also just Sony's profiling tools in general. Microsoft have made some very impressive stuff, and honestly, the whole Xbox tool thing has become a complete freaking meme at this point. But I'm going to be real with you guys, it just wasn't good at launch. There were a lot of issues. And they have improved, but honestly, it's like Sony's are just still better. From my understanding, things may have changed. The info I have is a little bit older at this point, but from the last I heard, Sony's tools for profiling are just still better. And also developers are just more familiar with them. It's kind of like, this is not 100% true, but it's kind of roughly like saying, you have a tool that you're familiar with, right? Sony just took that, they improved it in pretty much every single way. They gave a bunch of extra cool features, and they essentially said to developers, have at it. With the Xbox, that's not quite what happened. It's like, oh, okay, well, you're going to kind of learn all of this stuff because we're pretty much doing an entirely new development environment. Now, again, that is not 100% accurate, but roughly speaking. Another thing is developers had access to PlayStation 5 hardware earlier, and that's one of the reasons. Basically, the PS5 development kits, you may remember things like Oberon, Ariel, and all this other crap. The early versions didn't even have ray tracing. And one of the reasons behind this is developers basically were given access to the hardware, but with Xbox it came up later. And this was something that we learned a lot about in leaks, because, you know, the early PS5 leaks were like, well, where the hell is ray tracing? Because the rumor is that there's ray tracing, but the GPU doesn't support ray tracing, so what the hell? And it's simply because at that point, the early versions that were being shipped out to developers or being tested internally, they literally just didn't have ray tracing kind of bolted into the hardware. And this also seems to be somewhat confirmed by Cerny when he was speaking in a recent interview. He was talking about the fact that basically ray tracing was something they didn't really know if they were going to adopt early on, and it was a whole thing. And obviously they have pushed it, and ray tracing is really cool. Another factor, and this is certainly true if Japanese studios, it's not so much for Western studios like American, for example, but certainly for Japanese, and this is somewhat of a blanket statement, but it's simply a case that the PS5 often, frequently, is the lead platform. And therefore, because it's the lead platform, either because developers are simply more familiar with it, or because, well, it just is a case that they are selling more copies on the PS5. Simple as. And yeah, and that's a really big factor. Now, I, again, really do wish Microsoft to do very well for the next generation. I think that having Xbox in the gaming industry is really important, or at least another player. Nintendo, like, if Nintendo were kind of doing things more like, you know, like a GameCube, I would be less like, eh. But ultimately the Switch 2, from, you know, what I've leaked, and also the general rumors, it's going to basically be, well, you know, a slightly iterative version. It's going to be decently more powerful. It's going to have DLSS, perhaps, you know, some pretty big improvements, but it's certainly not going to be like, you know, it's not going to be PS5 Pro or PS6 levels of performance, let's just be honest. So I think Microsoft being there in some way or another to keep Sony having some competition is really important, but I think they need a bigger reset. And hopefully the next generation of Xbox is going to be, from everything I'm hearing, the PS6 is going to be absolutely crazy. There's some really nice stuff that I've kind of already spoken about a little bit in a previous video, but apparently they're doing a lot of simulation. How that's going to work, I'm not 100% certain at the moment, whether it's going to be something like an NPU or whether it's done on a GPU or what. But one of the rumors is that they want to do a lot of physics simulation, cloth simulation. Yes, there are things like that in games already, but it's going to be that much more advanced. So, you know what? Games at the moment, like, is possibly part of a much larger conversation. But, you know, games at the moment, you're looking at the budgets of these AAA games, it's like 100, 200 million, 300 million, and then you've got marketing. It's going to be very interesting to see what direction the gaming industry goes in. I think that's just about it, though, for this video, guys. This turned out to be a bit longer than anticipated, unfortunately. I don't know what hair or something on my back. It's itching like crazy. With that said, I will leave you to it. Take care of yourselves. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.